Let's kick off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Global Compliance Institute. We're going to be talking today on the subject of the basics of compliance and risk management in global businesses. I'm going to be standing in for Alia Mahmood today, as she has unfortunately not been able to join us. My name's Iain Armstrong. My career in financial services goes back to the start of the millennium, when I began work for the UK Financial Services Regulator, which was then called the Financial Services Authority, now called the Financial Conduct Authority. I was in their enforcement division for just under a decade. My first cases there were really focused on conduct and mis-selling, and then I moved into the unauthorized business side, where I worked on criminal investigations into investment fraud. Following that, I had a number of financial crime specialist roles in the second line at two of the UK's biggest banks, before moving on to a third large UK bank, where my focus broadened out again to encompass non-financial risk more broadly, culminating in me serving as the first line head of risk for the SME business banking app known as Metal, and also some early oversight of risk on what is now called NatWest Boxed. For the last couple of years, I've been in the RegTech space, working at one of the industry's leading financial crime risk intelligence providers, Comply Advantage. And I'm joined today by two experts in the field of risk and compliance, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves. First, we have Nicola Johnston. Nicola, hi. Tell us.
Hi. So my name is Nicola Johnston. I have been working in compliance since the millennium as well. But very much on the other side from Iain. I've never worked for a regulator. I have worked for stockbrokers, investment banks, asset managers, and my last proper job, as some people would describe it, was working for one of the big four. Since 2013, I've worked for myself. I am effectively a management consultant. I'm the person you bring in if you have a problem or you think you might have one, to have a look at things, to run training programs, to be, I like to describe it as the voice of reason. Not panicking people, because panicking people never actually achieves anything, but saying, actually, maybe you should be doing it like this, or this is a risk, we need to consider it, or the regulations have changed. Actually, what are you doing here? So that is very much my background. I have a postgraduate in financial services law and I have an MBA. So apparently I'm quite in demand because of those skills.
I'm not surprised to hear that at all. And really fascinating history. I always think about people in your line of work, but I'm quite envious, because I imagine in the space of 1 year, you probably learn what would take you sort of 3 years if you were just working directly in a financial institution. So you get that really broad exposure to lots of different problems. So fantastic to have you on today. And next we have Holger Pauco-Dirscherl. Holger, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, certainly. Pleasure to be here and be part of this webinar together with my two colleagues and with all of our participants. So my name is Holger Pauco-Dirscherl. I'm from Germany. I'm in the industry since far over 15 years now. Started as an analyst, worked myself up towards global responsibility at one of Germany's biggest banks, before going into the consulting realm. I'm also a freelance consultant, working on various projects, both in the first line, KYC remediations, and so on, but also in the second line as interim MLRO or compliance manager, also supported various audits in this field. Unfortunately, mostly I'm not the person who's called when they identify a problem, but after they have a problem. So I tend to have a lot of projects where I'm responding to regulatory inquiries, to audit findings, and so on. So still helping to support customers, but mostly after they're already in some deep troubles. I'm also having various credentials from ACAMP and also from the CGI, one of the certified compliance managers, some credential, I also quite enjoyed learning, learned a lot also about various topics. I didn't have too much touch points yet. Yeah, looking forward to also talk a bit more about those topics today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Holger. And we're looking forward to it too. And I completely agree. It's that sense of needing to always be learning. I think it's a really important trait to have in our line of work, actually, and never to feel that you sort of reach the top of the knowledge tree. So in today's global business environment, we're seeing the compliance landscape become increasingly dynamic, increasingly complex and complicated. Organizations face what appears to be a never-ending stream of challenges in terms of managing regulatory risks, maintaining compliance oversight, and ensuring that they're adopting really proactive approaches to those evolving regulatory requirements. We're going to be exploring these topics today through the expertise of our fantastic panelists here. So I'd like to dive into our first topic, which is going to be about culture and risk management. So I'm sure that's a topic that's close to all of our hearts. I think we can all agree that culture plays a really, really critical role in shaping how organizations approach compliance and risk management. And I think all of us have worked in multinational type of environment and have had that experience where you'll see varying expectations coming from different regions, different markets, different geographies, etc. Real, compliance challenges that can be thrown up just by different cultural attitudes. And of course, the domestic level nuance of different regulations in different countries. So, Nicola, how would you say that organizations can approach this massive problem of managing these cultural differences while still maintaining that unified approach to risk and compliance at the group level?
I think the fundamental issue is leadership. What I have seen working in different businesses and in different environments is that if you have strong leadership who buys into what the compliance and the risk teams are trying to do globally, you tend to have far less of an issue. We do, as human beings, we follow leaders. So if you have a leader who is strong, who is decisive, and who has bought into it, there are going to be far less issues on the ground. That said, you have to be aware of the cultural differences. When I was thinking about what I was going to say today, one of the fundamental issues that I've come across is what we in the UK would describe as a bribe being completely acceptable in other countries. How do you manage that? I mean, first of all, you have to be aware and you have to understand it. And then you have to put the barriers in place. Are you going to just outlaw it completely? Or are you going to say, no, you can't do that? Which could, in countries where it is acceptable, completely hinder their ability to do business. So it's being aware of the cultural differences, and it's being aware of the impact that those cultural differences can have. At the end of the day, compliance has evolved so much from the 1980s, the 1990s, where it was very much seen as a business prevention unit. It's not. We all need to work together. We all want the businesses to be a success. So you can't just say, no, you can't do that. You have to understand the nuances behind it. That, I think, then feeds into the next point about good communication. You have to communicate what you're trying to do. You have to communicate the reasons behind it, which means that you have to understand it. There is no good in a leadership team or a risk team putting out something that says, no, you can't do that, or everybody's got to do that. You need to explain it to people. They need to understand. They need to buy into it, because otherwise it's just not going to work, and you're going to constantly come across obstacles. That, I think, then feeds into my other two main points: having clear policies and procedures around everything that the business does on a global level. Of course, there are going to be things which are different in the UK to the US, to Africa, to Asia. But if you can have an overarching policy and then procedures that feed into that, And the procedures may differ between regions, but if you can have an overarching policy which explains what the business is trying to do and how they are trying to get there, it makes life so much easier. My final point would be that you need to have comprehensive training. I mean, I think I'm a big believer in compliance training across the business, because it's the way that you get, I mean, if you're looking at your 3 lines of defense model, for example, your first line of defense is the business. If they don't understand or buy into what compliance and risk are trying to achieve, they're actually, in the nicest possible way, then they're useless. They're not your first line of defense. So if you train them, if you explain what you're doing, and yes, of course, there will be resistance to it, because there's always resistance to things like this. But if you can get their buy-in and you can keep communicating with them, it means that when you have an issue, you are ahead of the issue, that you can be proactive rather than having to be reactive. So that would be my fundamental approach to addressing this in a global business. Now, I mean, that's taken me, a couple of minutes to explain. It takes a lot longer than that to put it into practice.
Well, quite, doesn't it just? But no, I think that framework of the kind of 3 pillars of leadership, policies, training, is, in my own experience, when I've seen it work well, it always works well because of those 3 pillars. I mean, my first role in banking was very policy focused, and so I was just when you were talking about policy, it occurred to me that there's something here about record keeping, and where there is a need for a particular market to have to deviate from policy requirement. It's just about having really, really clear visibility of that deviation or that.
Absolutely.
And then, sorry.
With something like record keeping, my approach has always been that you go with the highest possible standard. So if one jurisdiction wants you to record keep for 5 years and another it's 7 years, just do 7 years, because it means that nothing is going to fall through the gaps, and you're not going to end up with those fiddly little arguments about, well, this client is based here, but they're doing this business here, so what do we do? You just make it easy for everybody, and it means, yes, sometimes that you are over-egging a situation, but if it's not having an impact on the day-to-day commercial business of the company, do it.
Absolutely. And also, I think it's, so one organization I worked in, which I won't name, had sort of on an annual basis, reaffirmed an exception to policy that was due to this exact type of issue. So a local level regulatory requirement, which meant that a local business had to deviate from policy. And it was found during my time there that actually that regulation had fallen away a couple of years before, but the exception had just sort of been approved year after year, and it was no longer needed. So I think it's that thing of, it's just good governance, isn't it, to kind of periodically kick the tires on things like that and say, well, is this actually still required? And last part, I'm interested in your thoughts, because you mentioned training, and I'm also quite passionate on the subject of training. Have you seen any particular approaches? Do you have any sort of really preferred way of delivering training? And because obviously a lot of us have experienced the whole kind of computer-based training where you're sitting clicking through essentially a dynamic slide deck. There are some schools of thought that say actually in person is much better, or actually doing group exercises. I tend to think it's good to have a mixture, like reinforcing.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think computer-based training definitely has its place. But having worked on a trading floor, I'm also very conscious that it's quite easy to cheat. And so if I am implementing computer-based training with a client, I always make sure there's a test at the end. And there will be a sneaky question in there, and it's not actually to catch, well, it is to catch people out. It's to see who's read the material and who hasn't. Because, especially if something like anti-money laundering training, I know it's for some people, it's not the most fascinating subject in the world. It is necessary that they understand it for their own protection. And I do, for something like that, I will always caveat it and go, look, you need to do this because it's protecting you. Other training things, we when I worked for a global asset manager, one of the ways that we raised compliance awareness was we used to have voluntary lunchtime sessions, and they got lunch. That's
Right.
amazingly successful. And you're just talking about sandwiches or something like that, but it gets people in and they engage. And one of the things that I mean, we're talking about training here. One of the things I'm passionate about is I don't like sitting delivering a lecture, because that's not actually, it's not interactive. People don't tend to ask questions at the end of that. I want to actually sit there with a smaller group of people and get a discussion going, because then as well, I'll learn something, because somebody suddenly says, oh, well, what about this? And it's like, hang on a minute, I didn't know we were doing that. Or actually, that's a really good point. I haven't thought about how that would impact this side of the business. So I always try and tailor in-person sessions. But I do think, I mean, I know we're all moving towards everything being computer-based and AI. I think in-person is so valuable, because one of the things that compliance departments really need is face time. You want people to know who you are. You want them to know that you're approachable, that you know your stuff, that if you don't know your stuff, you'll say, I don't know, and go and find out the answer. Because if there is a crisis, if you want them to go, actually, hang on a minute, that's the person I can go and speak to. You know, I can go and have a conversation with them. They're not going to overreact. They're not going to shout and scream. They're going to deal with the issue at hand. And I think if you look at the issues that there have been with firms over the last 20 years and the large fines that have been handed out and compliance failings, you tend to find that compliance departments have been operating in a silo, and that they haven't known about the problem because people don't know where they sit, or they don't know who they are, and they don't want to pick up the telephone. It's a little bit like an HR department, that you want people, you want to be visible. And I think it's come on so much, and I'm sure you've both seen this in your careers. The visibility of compliance and risk teams has come on so much in the last 20 years. And it's not the department to be avoided anymore, like it was sort of 2000, 2001. And, you know, you didn't invite the compliance team out for lunch because God knows what might happen. And now I find that you are included in things. And I think it's brilliant. And that is a huge cultural, using culture in another meaning. That's a huge cultural change, but it's so important. Going back to how we're using culture in this instance, that's something that I find in the UK and I find in Asia. I don't find it in the US. I find that there is still a little bit of a standoff between the commercial side of the business and the risk side. And there is and it's just, I mean, it could be particularly specific to the clients that I work with, but there is a bit of a gulf there and a bit of a divide. And when I go in, it's one of the first things that I try and bridge. The other thing I find, again, going back to culture as we're using it in this discussion, is that, and this is being very generalist about it, but if I go to an office in Singapore and say, this is what we're doing in the UK, because you're a UK subsidiary, we're going to need to do it here too. The perfect example being consumer duty. They will go, okay, great, what do we need to do? And you can sit there and you can have a discussion about it. If you go to the US, they go, well, what are the rules and why do we need to do it? And there's a lot more questions about, I suppose they get a lot more territorial. And this is a huge generalization. But certainly I found I implemented TCF, so the real predecessor to consumer duty, for a global asset management company. The Far East, Asia, Africa, absolutely brilliant, not an issue. Sit down, explain it to him. The US sat there and went, why do we need to do this? It's like, well, you're the US office of a UK company. It is, you know, and it's also, it's like, it's best practice. Just let's not be silly here. This is what we're not doing it. And it took the chief executive getting on the phone and going, no, you are doing this, to actually get it done. But then that was the necessary means to an end. I'm not an enormous fan of doing it that way unless you absolutely have to, because people's backs are up and everyone gets a bit defensive.
Yeah, I suppose you get off on the wrong foot, but yet nonetheless, I really sympathise with you in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, if you've tried everything else, you know, and that's why, going back to what I was saying initially, that's why leadership is so important. because I did literally just go to the chief executive and go, I've tried everything I can think of. Do you have any ideas? He picked the phone up and went, "You're doing it. Just stop this."
Yeah.
And I was kind of standing there going, "Oh God, this is not going to be pretty." But, because he bought into it and he understood it, and he understood why we were having to do it, and the whole background in the UK, it was very easy for him to sell it to them.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, absolutely fascinating insights there. I completely agree. I think that tone from the top, as we always talk about it, and the reason why we always talk about it, isn't there? When it's even the concepts kind of evolve now to tone from above and then tone from within. So I think, but if you get the first bit right, you'll find it kind of permeating throughout the organization. And so key takeaway, training, absolutely essential. But Holger is probably not sufficient in its own right. So how can the organizations that we work for and that our audience are working for, what can they do to make sure that the advice of the compliance function is communicated in a way that is kind of continuously absorbed and integrated into the day-to-day running of the business?
Absolutely, and I think Nicola, you already spoiled a lot of important things here, because when we think about training, which is one of the 4 pillars of an effective compliance program, people tend to limit themselves to only this webinars or maybe a face-to-face training, so some structured, organized events. US regulators, also UK regulators, brought up already a couple of years ago in the guidance, for example, to the FCPA, that training is only one example of what they call continuous advice or communications. Because if you only have this formalized training event, it's just not enough to, as you named it, to integrate compliance into the culture of the company. And I think when we just step back and think about what are we doing on a continuous daily basis as compliance officers, talking to people in the front office, also discussing with people in management and so on, I think then we realize that we are training every day our people. Every call I'm having from a relationship manager telling him where to find certain requirements, how to identify a UBO, or how to integrate the MiFID documentation into the processes, is continuous advice, is a form of training, but it's far more informal, and I would also say it's a bit more effective in this way. And Nicola mentioned that the face-to-face trainings are important. I totally agree. And one of the most important aspects for also face-to-face time or visibility of compliance is that people experience their actual human beings working in compliance. They're actually also nice guys and girls working there. Some people can also make a joke, who are approachable, who also want to protect the employees in the company. And once people realize that they are nice human beings, that you can also approach, and that they're not having this compliance club and beating up people if they make a mistake, then they also approach you and ask you things before they're going into a wrong direction. For example, with AML trainings, I had a lot more escalations after such face-to-face trainings, a lot more calls, people saying, look here, I just had a customer call and he mentioned this or that, what should I do? Should I escalate this? Is this something that you want to have? And if you take this serious and also have like a feedback culture and telling you what you did is absolutely great, it's exactly what we also mentioned in the training, and it was great because of this or that, or this would not be interesting because of other reasons, then people understand, and also people not only they take you serious, but they also take you as an important part of the overall culture and the overall business setup of the company.
Fantastic. So are there any approaches that, in addition to those that you would you think are kind of innovative and not necessarily applied widely in the industry that you wish were applied more widely?
So I love the concept of lunch and learn. So free lunch is always something that sells quite well. Yeah, just this kind of informal sessions where people also have a possibility to just ask questions without feeling embarrassed. I've also had a great experience with just going into team meetings and just also presenting what is on our agenda at the moment from a compliance perspective, what keeps us awake at night, what are important projects, what is the impact also on the business side. What I also find quite positive received was to ask the team leader or the manager to go out of the room so that only the employees are there together with me. They can ask everything without feeling that they might be judged by the team head or by the manager, or it might impact their performance. So just giving them the possibility to ask questions without being afraid. So in informal sessions, I think it's quite well. I also saw a lot of good feedback, having kind of newsletters where we are communicating new regulations, new red flags or typologies from an AML perspective, adverse media from competitors, what happened there. So just not only telling the news itself, but also what does it mean for us? What is the impact for us? And people can relate far more on actual live examples than anything that you can make up. And when they really see this is something that happened in the industry, or even better, that happened at our organization, and this is how we overcome it, they will definitely take more out of it than just by examples that were just made up.
I really like actually the suggestion of meetings where or sessions, you know, where perhaps the leader of the team isn't present, because I think you've hit on something really important there actually, about that sort of embarrassment factor that you get sometimes when people are sitting in a group. They're a little bit shy, they're nervous to kind of ask a question because they might think that it reflects badly on them. And I think removing the team lead or the manager from the situation is actually quite a clever way of getting around that. And yeah, I mean, lots of things you just said there really resonated. Actually, I think the point about like almost adopting different channels, like the newsletter. That's something I've really seen in my career. Is if you want to deliver a message, sometimes it really helps if you decide what the message is and then sort of deliver it via sort of 6 different channel, like, so maybe once in a newsletter, once in a addressing the team in a town hall type environment, another time in a more intimate lunch and learn type session. I think, yeah, there's studies about the human brain kind of responds quite well to receiving information through in several different formats before it eventually sinks in. So I really like that. And so I suppose this brings us more widely to the issue of how you communicate, communications channels, and particularly where, as we all have, working in multinationals that have departments, products and services offered in multiple different countries. So staying with you, Holger, for a moment, what about that problem? It's a big problem. I'm just lumping it on you. So what what methods have you seen as in terms of effective communication across multiple departments, often in, to Nicola's earlier point, maybe dealing with silos within countries or even within departments?
And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have, or 2 biggest challenges that we have. First of all, that we as a compliance function need to break up the silos. Silos that sometimes we created at one point because people are afraid, people don't want to share information anymore, and so on. So also allowing a culture where you can communicate, where you can also make mistakes, and it's okay if you do a mistake just because the training was not suspicions or you didn't know, it doesn't mean that you get fired directly. It's just if you stand up to your mistake and accept it, and so we're getting better as an organization. I think this is something we also need to accept. If I'm doing 100 things, there will be one or two mistakes, even by myself. Even I'm a compliance professional. So do people in the first and second line also on a daily basis. So this I think is one of the important parts to break up the silence and also to make people understand that we are all trying to do the right thing, but sometimes we are making mistakes, which is also okay. And I think one of the other things is when working in compliance or working in AML, in regulatory compliance, we are in a preventive role, and prevention sucks. Prevention is not sexy to sell. Because how can I sell something that never happened? How can I sell all of the risks that never appear, that never materialize, that we're never getting punished for by a regulator? So if I'm working in the front office position, a relationship manager for a business line, I can sell all the big and fancy deals. I can sell all the millions of euros, dollars, yens, whatever I bring to the company. But prevention, I cannot sell this. And I think one important part is not only to communicate compliance itself, and to sell compliance and what is the benefit for you as an individual, but also for the wider organization, but also to sell ourselves as a compliance function and what we are bringing to the company. Nicola already mentioned that in previous times, and previous times is not like 20 years ago, it would say like 3, 4, 5 years ago even, the compliance was widely perceived as an obstacle for making business, as someone who's always saying no to business. Unfortunately, a lot of compliance colleagues still have this thinking. It's black and white. Either it's in the law or it's forbidden. There is no risk appetite. There is no risk acceptance. It's all everything black and white. And I think it's fundamentally wrong. And if also from a compliance perspective, we have to switch that mindset that we are business enablers, that we are a support function. We are helping business to do good business, to do the right business, to bring money to the company, but mitigating the risks on the way, together with business, as a partner of business. I think if we can start to communicate this more, and such, as I mentioned before, such informal sessions are one of the pieces for it. I've also seen organizations having huge marketing campaigns for their compliance function. If you think about the more aged people here, might remember a company called Google, which is now Alphabet, and don't be evil as the slogan. So if it's don't be evil, this is something very appealing, and people who start working identify with this. So compliance nowadays, it's also something important to communicate, is also a reason why people are getting hired as companies. Do you want to be associated with a criminal organization or a bank which is supporting criminal organizations or any other company? No, you want to work for a company which don't be evil, which is doing the right things. And this is why I think compliance is both from a customer side, nowadays an argument to engage with company, but also for employees. And I've also worked in companies who are under high scrutiny of a regulator. And a lot of persons also quit their jobs. They also go to other employers. So that and this is also not only frustrating for the people who still want to do the right thing in the company, because they're getting more and more work, and other people are just leaving, but also getting an operational risk for the organization, as they also need to find replacements. They're losing the history of the organization, people who know all of the bits and pieces. So I think the selling compliance is kind of a marketing campaign is important. And just linking it to something you both already tackled, it's also about the tone from the top. I've seen one of my colleagues in a employees assembly where he's talking about the importance of compliance, and the CEO in the background was looking every 5 minutes on his watch and start writing emails while the compliance manager is talking about the importance of compliance. So nobody's taking this guy serious anymore, and nobody's taking compliance serious anymore. And I also think that it's important to communicate with senior management also that my message about compliance is only as good as your message. So only if we both play in one band, then we are getting this song in the records. We are getting in the hit rates on the #1. And I think this is what the whole organization needs to realize. And I think as this kind of informal meetings, step by step, is important to get to this point.
I really like the reference to Google actually, and the very famous "Don't be easy" line. And you're right to say you know, the reason that whole tagline existed was about tone from the top, right? Because initiatives like "Don't be evil" come from the very top and they get pushed out to the whole organization. So it's a really good example of you know, I don't think any of us have worked for Google. I certainly haven't, and yet we all know that line, right? So that was how well communicated that line was, and particularly like what you said about you know, well, firstly, the perennial problem of quantifying the impact of compliance. I really, you know, I think we've struggled with this. Like how do you actually prove, you know, we haven't had, you know, an enforcement action against us? That's really difficult to do. Nicola, I can see you coming off mute, so I'm keen to hear.
No, I was going to say it is the quantifiable, because if your compliance department is successful, there is nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
If you're not successful, then you've had the appropriate regulator in, you've had fines and all of that. But trying to sell that to the business, and they're sitting there going, but there's not an issue because nobody's been in, and it's like, yes, but that's the marker of success.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's certainly for a lot of the old school, that's really quite a difficult sell. And there is but just because, and it's like, it's not just because, it's, you know, prevention is better than a cure. My threat always used to be, having worked for somebody who did have to appear in front of the Treasury Select Committee in the UK, my threat was always, do you want to have to do that? And they'd sit and go, no. It's like, right, so do it my way then. It makes life a lot easier.
That's quite a powerful incentive, isn't it? I think in terms of other incentives, particularly for those, you know, at the very top of the business, I think what you said, Holger, about, you know, if we are as an organization found to have breached you know, some regulation or allowed something particularly unpleasant to happen on our books, the message is, it's not just going to be your compliance staff who are uncomfortable with that. You're going to see people in commercial, you know, business roles who might depart because, you know, they feel a moral conflict working for the company. Then you can lose those people, and that maybe is going to land a bit better with those kind of CEO, COO type roles as well. And just
it also, sorry, Ian, to interject, it makes recruitment that much harder as well.
Yeah,
because I mean, you know what it's like. You get approached by somebody and you think, hang on a minute, you've got really quite an iffy reputation.
Yeah.
Do I want that on my CV? Quite possibly not. Or you're having to pay more to get good people in to sort out the problems that have been left behind. And I don't mean that from a compliance perspective. I mean that in the commercial teams, you know, the traders, you've got all of that, because they are taking a risk by being associated with a specific organization.
Yeah, and not to mention PR as well. I mean, you can end up spending a fortune.
I mean, that's always been my big one, the reputational damage of having a business's name splashed all over the press. I mean, you can't even compare the fine to the reputational damage, because, I mean, the reputational damage is enormous, especially when in the UK, when you're dealing with retail clients, you don't want to be the firm who has, you know, is associated with PPI or failings with managing an ISA or something like that, because you will watch the money just flood out the door.
Yeah. So, Holger, any final thoughts on how companies, particularly where you have the local team and the global team, how you balance, that need to allow obviously a degree of local autonomy in community?
I think both is quite important. You need to have a global message which is consistent throughout your organization. Also, as many international laws like the FCPA or UK Privacy is also judging you on this global approaches. But still, you always need to have a local discretion for the bits and pieces which are particular to your own local regulatory setup. And I think it's important to communicate it, that both sides know the expectations and the requirements. But I think we need to have both as an important part of the overall compliance communications, the global perspective, but also a local view to ensure we are compliant. And as Nicola said, if we have a different standard, we need to have a global standard, and where the local standard is lower, we need to uplift it to our global standard, which is quite important. But I think we already also used a lot of time for trainings and communications, which, as you all said, is one of the important parts. But I think that there's also something we want to tackle today, which is risk heat maps, and also tackling the enterprise-wide risk assessment. So Iain, just have a question for you. Do you believe that the traditional risk heat map approach is effective, or is it time to rethink how we assess risk across the enterprise?
Yeah, thank you. So I hope this isn't an unpopular opinion, but I think we are long overdue a rethink on this subject of these heat maps. And I think if we're honest with ourselves as risk management practitioners, that many of the most commonly applied frameworks for risk management don't necessarily help business to truly manage their risk. So for the audience, and I suspect most of the audience are familiar with these things, but underpinning these kind of large scale heat map overviews of risk, usually you have a risk taxonomy, a control library that you sort of offset against the risk. You have some kind of scoring matrix based on impact and likelihood. And then ultimately, in larger organizations, you might have your business line risk and control self-assessment, which might then feed into those enterprise-wide risk assessment views. Or, as I've also seen in my career, those local level risk and control self-assessments might actually be ignored, and the enterprise-wide risk assessment is essentially a kind of repeat of the RCSA, but it's done by a different team of people and potentially reaching a different conclusion. And all of these, there's a huge industry around this. It produces these artifacts, these risk assessments that are then dutifully reported up to the leadership of the business. But when I found myself, in a leadership role in a risk team, I did begin to ask myself, are these actually helping the business to run effectively? Are they actually contributing to our leadership's overall understanding of the real risks that are present on a day-to-day level in the running of the business? And I began to feel that there must be a better way out there. I think it's surprising to me how many companies continue this practice of assessing risks in terms of, essentially lists of risk. That I'm not saying it's completely redundant. I think there's definitely a place for it, but I was often struck by how sort of divorced those documents were from the business itself and the kind of day-to-day running of it. I think what I'd like to see is a bit more kind of incorporation of strategic planning into the risk management process. And I think, often this, I would say this situation is almost partly enabled by regulators and auditors, because regulator turns up or the external auditor turns up, they expect to see some sort of extensive risk register. I mean, here in the UK, obviously there's sort of governance code requirements that mandate that the boards oversee risks. And so we've sort of evolved into this position of, okay, well, how do you prove that you're overseeing risk? Well, I have a risk register. So it sort of becomes this kind of path of least resistance. Now I realize I'm kind of shouting into the hurricane here because this is the established way of doing things. I think in my own career, my own time spent as a first line head of risk, I really tried to move the needle a tiny bit in the other direction and say, let's actually manage risk in a more effective way. And I think, I always used to come back to that definition of risk being, the impact of uncertainty on your ability to achieve your objectives. And so if you sort of start from that position, I think there are more effective way that you can allow your board to claim that they really do have oversight of risk. I think that's you go.
So what approaches do you think are more effective ways to achieve this? And just one other thought I had, risk assessment and inventories, it seems to be quite static in the past. However, we are having a rapidly changing regulatory environment. Are those approaches still fit for purpose to cope this constant changing environment that we are dealing with?
Yeah, so you really hit on one of my issues with it, actually, which is that these exercises were, in my own experience, were typically performed essentially once a year. This kind of stock take of risks and looking against the register and saying, okay, this one's gone a little bit more red or this one's gone a bit more green. And you're right. I mean, the world just doesn't work that way. It's not like your kind of risk remains the same throughout the course of a year. There are all sorts of things that can impact it. Yeah, so in terms of more effective alternatives, obviously I'm kind of setting myself up here because I've said this way of doing things doesn't necessarily work. So what is a better way? I mean, the way I tried to move the dial a little bit in my own time spent, leading a risk team was really by adopting that objective centric approach. So actually asking, my CEO, various other leads in the business, what really are our key objectives as a business? And whatever you say, we're going to consider risk as the impact of uncertainty on our ability to achieve those objectives. And I think the part of the reason why that I found it genuinely focused the mind, and I think it filtered out into all sorts of other beneficial impacts, like better tone from the top, is that if you frame the question that way for a leadership team, it sort of forces them to actually think, firstly, what are we trying to do here? And secondly, they're almost a bit more bought in to that the job of managing risk, because they kind of see it more directly as their job. And so my whole big thing really is that I've sort of lived through an area and I've worked in enough different environments now where I have seen really, really good approaches and less good approaches. And the less good approaches tend to be those environments where the compliance team have this almost parent-child relationship with the business. So they're sort of constantly wagging their finger, telling the business what it's done wrong. And the business almost adopts that sort of child position of, I've been told off for being naughty. Does that really promote the genuine ownership of risk? And I just, I don't think it does. And so I think looking at your business objectives and kind of seeing risk in light of that is really what kind of is going to flip the script a little in terms of how your business approaches risk. And I mean, there's lots of the kind of primary text for for the management of risk that you look out there, things like you know, the ISO standards, the COSO standards, the Financial Stability Board's principles for effective risk appetite frameworks, which I think is over 10 years old at this point. You know, there's always this advocacy for boards to oversee the management's risk taking and risk management. And so, but as I say, I don't think presenting the board with a heat map is really allowing them to do that. I think boards should be much more aggressive in kind of evaluating the value of the information that they receive in these annual risk register reports. I think the problem is very few boards actually approach risk and their oversight of risk from that perspective of thinking about, okay, what are our top corporate objectives, and the risks are the impact on the likelihood of us achieving those objectives. I think as soon as you can start coaxing people to think about it that way, in my own experience, I've found you get much more buy, and it does filter through to that tone from the top.
I really I really like that approach because it's I think if you're presenting a board with a heat map or a risk register, it's very easy for them to pay lip service to it, but they don't actually buy in. And that's kind of somebody else's problem, and compliance and risk will deal with that. If you're saying to them, well, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the risks to you achieving that, they have to buy in. And suddenly it's like, well, how much do you want to achieve your objectives? And you're forcing that discussion. And I think that's, I mean, going back to the first point I made about leadership, I think that's where you get the leadership buy-in, you get the tone from the top. And suddenly it's not a risk and compliance issue, it's a commercial issue, it's a business issue. But it is a massive, just the way that compliance and risk have evolved, I think it's quite a big turnaround. I mean, it's a full 180, but on the other hand, that's the kind of thing that actually, if you have a good leadership team, should appeal to them, because it's something that they can get their heads around. It becomes far more tangible. Yeah,
I completely agree. And I think, yeah, you're right, actually. It's almost like this approach takes in everything that we've been talking about earlier in this session, really. It's that tone from the top, the communication, culture. I think you get all of those things starting to work together, and you will just sort of almost as a kind of byproduct, you'll see better risk management, and crucially, the quite, communication culture and things are, you don't need to invest a huge amount to start to change these things. You don't need some massive new piece of technology. In fact, I'd say it's not a problem you can even solve with technology. So I'm glad. I think we're all talking the same language here.
I think so.
Just as a little question for the end, how do you think technology will change our compliance roles? It's like, maybe most people would be interested here. Do you think the AI will replace all of us?
Well, I hope not. I think I read a really interesting thing about AI actually recently, which is it's very good for things for questions that have definite answers, so for maths and things like that. But I think, and so as we all know, the thing about risk management and compliance is that there very rarely are actually definite answers. A lot of it is about interpretation of things and trade-offs of, okay, well, we can do this, but we have to trade off this idea. So I think in the risk management profession, we're probably safe from AI for now. If I was a researcher at an investment bank, I might be feeling differently, because I think AI is already starting to kind of eat into those types of roles, because it's obviously very good at it's taking large amounts of data and sort of collating them and consolidating them and summarizing them. I think so. In my own career, I think that in terms of risk, I think I'd have to say, the application of technology in the cyber security space is one area where there's been this clear advantage and clear necessity for essentially using tech to fight tech, to fight cyber attacks and things like that. On a more broad note, I guess, the data analytics side of things. So, and Nicola, you're very familiar with the investment banking world. I think it's clear that technology has been just completely transformative, and you now have these sort of principal trading firms again sort of eating into the lunch of the investment banks, precisely because they have these incredibly sophisticated technological applications. Obviously, I work for a reg tech provider, so my business wouldn't exist without that need to apply technology. And I suppose we're also, a Comply Advantage, we're one of those suppliers who, part of what we're bringing to the market is that ability to absorb very, very large amounts of data that, you couldn't realistically do with a team of human beings unless you had like a million human beings. So yeah, I mean, those things spring to mind. I'm not sure about either of you. Do you think we're at risk from AI?
No, I think for exactly the reason you said, that I think there is so much nuance in compliance and risk that AI may well have its place, but it's never actually going to replace somebody who can sit down and interpret the information. And there is, I mean, you were mentioning trade-offs. There is that as well. That I mean, it's very rare in the compliance and risk world that you tell the business, no, they can't do something. It may not be commercially viable because of the hoops they're going to have to jump through in order to be compliant. And I don't think that that's something that AI is sufficiently sophisticated to deal with at the moment. It could tell them what the hoops are, but then it comes down to people, and and what a business is comfortable with, what a compliance team is or a risk team is comfortable with. So, well, I think it's definitely going to have its uses in risk management and compliance. In particular, because of the volume of information that comes out, new regulations, all this kind of stuff. And on a global level, that could be quite useful. It's a tool, but it's not a threat.
Yeah. Holger.
So just also for the sake of time, we have a couple of questions which we should also tackle. I just would like to take one of the questions about how do we train our board of directors, and how do we ensure that they know the essentials, but also get a proper training. So first of all, the board of directors is not exempted from any training requirements. Still, I would never go to the board of directors and say, okay, we are talking now about the 3 stages of money laundering. So I would do more like do some more strategic approach with them to say, look, what are the business goals? What are the risks that we get from our risk assessment? How do they challenge or threaten the risk that we want to achieve? What is on the regulatory horizon? What is the impact on the organization? And so yes, they would get all of them kind of a training from my side as compliance or AML manager or whatever topic, but it would be more on a strategic level rather than on simple concepts, because this is not what they're dealing in their day-to-day activities. They're not checking on cash transactions. They're not checking on the documentations from front office advisors and so on. They're more deciding how the organization will move forward and what will be the culture of compliance. So just one more question that I would like to just respond to. I hope for the participant that this was what he hoped for. I think, Iain, there was one question for you, and the example of the parent-child dynamic. So maybe you can take this one up.
Right. So yeah, discussing the parent-child dynamic, and the question essentially is the the person asking the question has said sometimes the business may approach compliance for advice, and there's this sense that they already know that the proposal is going to be rejected, and is that partly being done to almost reinforce this idea that compliance is the business blocker department, or is there something else at play? I mean, it's tempting to say the former. I actually don't think it's that cynical. I think we should take examples of that, of how we as risk and compliance professionals, we're really very familiar with this world of risk management, but examples like that to me highlight the fact that the business just isn't often familiar with it, and so they might in all good faith be asking those questions, even though to you they seem completely ridiculous, and there's absolutely no way that you're going to sign off whatever it is they're asking. But I'd see that as actually a good indicator of maybe an educational need, a need for what I sometimes call a teach-in. So take questions like that as a possible hint that you need to go and issue some sort of wider education for the business.
I think that's a really positive way of looking at it, Ian, and it's one that I tend to agree with. I mean, you're always going to get your serial offenders who are coming with the most, I mean, there's no other way to describe it than the most batshit crazy ideas, and you're looking at them going, seriously? Or did we not have this chat last week? But I think sometimes it is, that they know, I think it's a sign that they trust a compliance department, that they're coming in, they're saying, well, we've got this, we think that this is what compliance would say, but we're not quite sure. So we're coming to you for your view, for your opinion. Is there a way that we can do this? And going back to what we were saying earlier, it's face-to-face time with the business, and that is never a negative. It's, you're building a relationship, it's a communication. It's not great when you have to go, well, actually, no, you can't do this, or this is what you're going to have to do in order to do it. And they're looking at you going, but that's going to cost us. And you're like, yeah, I know, but it is. And sometimes you find that they come back and they tone down the idea, or they've turned it around and they've gone, well, can this work? And the whole collaboration, I think, is really important from a culture perspective, from a communication perspective. And I would much rather that somebody came to me every day for a month with the same idea, looking for a different answer, than that they went ahead and did something, knowing at the back of their head that it probably wasn't the right thing to do, but they just overrode compliance, and you end up having to be reactive to something rather than proactive, and you're not finding a solution. If they're coming to you, they're communicating, that's good. It's always good.
I love that. That is also a really positive take on it, actually. I think you're right. Maybe we should be more worried when they're not approaching compliance.
Oh, it frightens the living daylights out of me when they're not approaching. It's a bit like, well, it's going back to the parent-child analogy. If you've got a toddler and the toddler is quiet for 5 minutes, it's not good.
As someone who's had 2 toddlers, I can confirm you
yes.
Okay, look, fantastic. I am conscious of time, so I would like to thank you both so much for sharing your insights today. We've covered, I think, a huge amount of ground. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I hope for our audience that the discussion has given you some valuable takeaways that you can then go and implement into your own organizations. We will be sharing a recording of this session soon on the GCI channel. And if you have any questions around what's been discussed, please feel free to reach out to us. So once again, thank you to my fellow panelists. I'll ask you if either of you have any final thoughts, and if not, where can people find you online to receive more pearls of wisdom? Nicola?
I'm on LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out. I can't think of anything else to add right now. But if anybody does have any questions about anything that's been discussed today, I'm delighted to discuss.
Holger.
Same here. So LinkedIn, I think, is the most powerful communication tool, and also the best tool to connect. And just the last statement, don't be evil. I think this is something to always remember.
Absolutely. Well said. All right, well, we'll end there. Thank you all for joining, and thanks again to my panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.